But one thing I wanted you guys to do, if you could put in chat just what your favorite failure was. However you want to define that. It can be yours or someone else's. But just why don't you put it in chat for everyone. My poor cat, my poor injured cat is in the background. Maybe they're just setting up. Lisa Francesca's here. She's also an MFA alumna. I'm hopeful that I don't want to start too early and to miss a few people. Get a few people won't make the beginning, but I don't want to delay too much. I will put in the chat. I think my favorite personal failure is probably the relationship before I met my husband 25 years ago. So that would be one of my favorite failure. And I think artistically, my favorite failure was probably some ill-conceived short stories that I wrote when I was right after I got my BA and before I went back to grad school to study critical thinking, critical writing, because that's really where my skill is. Anyway, well, you guys think about it. And in the meantime, I'm going to turn the mic or whatever you want to call a Zoom screen over to Johnny Damm. And he's going to be presenting from his new book, Failure Biographies. And he joins us from, you got your doctorate at Georgia Tech?
University of Georgia.
University of Georgia. Right. And how long have you been with us at San Jose State?
I think this is my 4th year.
Wow.
Great. No, yeah, 4th year.
Wonderful. Well, we're happy to have you here. And now I will just give you the floor.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone who is here. So yeah, I'll be reading from my new book, Failure Biographies. It's a nonfiction graphic novel that tells true stories of failed artists. I should just say that the book takes its cue from Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure, in that it sort of honors and is sort of interested in the geography of failure as sort of an anti-capitalist space of possibility. I guess I should also mention that I make my comics in sort of unconventional means. My comics are made sort of specifically from other comics. Specifically 40s and 50s sci-fi and horror comics. The first piece I'll share was made sort of from a digital means, but the other pieces are physical collages that I actually sort of cut up, and it's combines elements of comics with Depression era photography and a couple other things. And the last thing I should note is that as I present sort of my comics panels, whenever you see words in speech bubbles, these are quotations. These are actually things that the artists that I'm profiling actually said. So, and then at the end of the pieces, I'll let you know where some of the places those are from. All right, let me pull this up. Everybody can see this? Yes. All right. So I'll just start out. And this first piece is on a filmmaker named Alice Guy Blaché. And she was sort of famously considered sort of the first real film director that was in France in sort of the silent era, the sort of really early era of moving pictures. Dynamo, Science Comics #7. France, 1896. Alice Guy works as a secretary for the inventor Leon Gaumont, whose company manufactures cameras and film. In 1896, unions did not exist. The work week was 6 days, sometimes 7. Hours of work, unlimited. This is what is called today La Belle Époque. With her employer, she attends a demonstration of a new technology, the motion picture. I was already bitten by the demon of the cinema. Guy asks her employer for permission to create demo reels for the company's new cameras, short fictional productions. Gaumont relents. On the express condition that this would not interfere with secretarial duties. Guy's first film, The Fairy of the Cabbages, runs 60 seconds. My youth, my inexperience, my sex, all conspired against me. I had been left to work out alone the difficulties at the beginning, to break new ground. By 1906, Guy has founded her own studio, made nearly 600 films, and largely defined the modern role. Not only is a woman as well fitted to stage a photo drama as a man, but in many ways she has a distinct advantage. Of motion picture director. Anything went, if only there were happy endings. There is not a happy ending. Art and reality were both lost. We're both lost there, surely. Talking pictures deprived it of a great deal of poetry. A husband easily doubts the talents of a wife. I knew in what a wasp's nest he had fallen. The introductions of talking pictures hurts, but it is her husband, a former Gaumont employee, assuming control of the studio, that does the greatest damage. Is it a failure? Is it a success? I don't know. I lived an intensely interesting life for 28 years. All right. And that's where the text, the speech bubbles and that come from. She has a long out of print autobiography, and the other part comes from an article she wrote about a woman's place in photoplay production. All right, I'm gonna move on and to another artist, or in this case, this one's an artist collective. An Argentinian artist group called Tucumán Arte, who were active during in Argentina under sort of the military dictatorship. So this one's called End Result, Tomb of Terror #14. And I should just say that I depict the artists here as space aliens. End result. Buenos Aires, 1968, the first national conference on avant-garde art. Under the eye of Argentina's military dictatorship, a small group of artists debate how best to stage a revolution. Art is not a peaceful activity, nor the decoration of a bourgeois life. In response to police censorship of the work in the Experiencia 68 exhibition, art implies an active confrontation with reality. The artists take their pieces from the museum and destroy them in the street. The life of Che Guevara is a work of art. Death to all bourgeois institutions. Long live the art of revolution. Finished with museums and galleries, the artists plan a new collective work. To counter the government's official information on national living conditions, we aspire to transform every piece of reality into an artistic work shown to the conscience of the world. Tucumán Arde. Tucumán is burning. First stage, gathering documentary material on the social reality of the province. Second stage, confrontation and verification of the Tucumán reality. Third stage, the denunciation exhibit. Tucumán is an impoverished sugar-producing region, touted by the government as the Garden of the Republic. Filled with economists, working with economists, journalists, and sociologists, the artists fill 4 floors of a labor union's headquarters with the social reality of the province. We will no longer place our talent at the service of our enemies. Charts on the connections between government officials and the owners of the sugar monopolies. Lights dimming every 10 minutes to represent how often a child dies in the province. Newspaper clippings on workers killed by police. Projected films and slides, speakers blaring interviews with residents, the region's coffee without sugar given to every visitor, a bombardment of information and experience. We show the true enemy and inspire the people with hatred and energy for the struggle. Visit Tucumán, the garden of misery. The first Tucumán Arte exhibit lasts 2 weeks. Restaged in Buenos Aires, police order it closed on the 2nd day. Art is all that mobilizes and agitates. Art radically denies this way of life and says, let's do something to change it. Fourth stage, founding of a new aesthetic and evaluation. After the closing, most of the artists quit producing work. Some exiled, some disappeared, and some joining guerrilla groups to be killed in action. For a time, political art all but disappears in Argentina, with the following years known as silence of Tucumán Arte. And that's where that text comes from. All right, just a couple, I'll just do two more artists. And this one is an Austrian Chilean performance artist named Lorenza Botner. And I think that's all you need to know. Venus, Adventurers into the Unknown, number 50. New York City, 1982. The Venus de Milo performance. An armless woman stands frozen on a tall pedestal. My professor in art school told me that I was, in fact, a walking performance. Of course, that started me thinking about the term. What actually is a performance? In some ways, I'm an exhibitionist, and I like it. But I was not always an exhibitionist. It came as a result of my handicap. People stare at me whether I dress conservatively or very flamboyantly. There was a time when all I drew and portrayed was myself. And I drew myself without arms and in the nude. In other performances, Lorenza Botner paints in front of audiences. Brush and mouth or feet, her movements blend with dance. One can have one's own aesthetic appeal. I became an artist by accident. I saw how many statues lost their arms, but they have lost nothing of their beauty. I am very observant. I enjoy observing. Botner has no interest in prosthetics. A transgender woman, she also decides against surgery. I had enough of hospitals anyway. My professor told me I wouldn't have to make an effort. I became an artist by accident. It just so happened to me more than I chose it. Everything I did would be a performance. I am an exhibitionist. All right. And I'll finish off with one more. And this one is on the Los Angeles assemblage artist, Noah Purifoy, who was active during the Watts uprising in the 60s. All right, Fly by Night, Black Magic number 16. Los Angeles, 1974. Noah Purifoy stops making art to become a social worker. The reality is that since the riots, nothing has been restored. Nothing has been improved. Socially or economically. Art of itself is of little or no value if it does not affect a change in the behavior of human beings. The students in the towers participated in the riot. Most everyone did. They would loot and stash their loot in and around the art center. We permitted that. I had a strong affinity for Blacks, and I wanted to experience us at the level where we lived at. Assemblage puts two or more unrelated objects, puts together two or more unrelated objects. At the time of the Watts Rebellion in 1965, Purifoy directed the Watts Tower Arts Center, teaching art classes and organizing cultural events. The community were making Molotov cocktails and throwing them at the police. They were buying nails and tacks from the hardware store and strewing them on the street. Everybody was excited and everybody was participating. Nobody had ever seen shapes and forms quite like this before. Melted neon signs, medicine bottles embedded in the molten remains of plastic raincoats, pieces of smashed automobiles. With Judson Powell, a musician who also taught at the center, he headed into the streets to collect. We uncovered them and we thought they were little jewels. The pair returned there again and again. The debris was still smoking. We ventured into the rubble like the other junkers. By September, we had collected 3 tons of charred wood and fire-molded debris. Purifoy and Powell invited other artists to work with them and create an exhibit from these materials. I'd graduated from art school, and I had 10 years of experience vaguely with artists. The resulting exhibit opened in spring of 1966. 66 signs of neon traveled for 3 years, showing throughout California and in Washington, D.C. But I wasn't an artist yet until Watts. That made me an artist. Noah Purifoy thought he discovered the future. 2 or more seemingly unrelated objects assembled constitutes the possibility of communication. Art can become a new thing when used as a symbol through which someone becomes better. A change in the behavior of human beings. These fragmentations only mean that I am fragmented. By 1974, this future has not come. Nothing has been restored. Nothing has improved socially or economically. And Purifoy begins work at the Central City Community Health Facility of Los Angeles. I have less now than I ever did. I am not angry about anything. I promised everyone that I would resolve my anger, and I did. Therefore, I have no reason to do protest art. He eventually returns to art making in the 90s, but now refutes any suggestion of social content. If you make a life's work out of that, you're the one who suffers, not your public. I've been wanting to say that for a long time. I finally got it out. In the Southern California desert, he assembles a sprawling sculpture garden until his death. There's nothing left but art. The end. All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we can get some of our, if we can allow our guests to just be able to talk.
Populate the screen.
Yeah, so we're not like alone. I thank you for coming. I'm gonna, like I since you guys can talk now as you want, you can just come up with your own questions. I'll start out if you don't mind. My first question is that you say in an interview in the back of the book, you say, I make comics using a scanner, an X-Acto knife, in the library. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on how you use the library. Specifically, I'm wondering, how did you find all these stories about people and groups for your book, especially since so many of the common threads that link some of the narratives is that they became so obscure and unknown.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons I can't leave academia is I really need the university library. Like it's one of these things. It's like that and probably an Adobe subscription. But yeah, I mean, I researched for a long time in sort of looking for these stories. And I just go down kind of rabbit holes. I mean, I started the piece with something I didn't read, which was on this French writer named Raymond Roussel,
Mhm.
who, I mean, he's one of my favorite writers, and he was trying to do something totally different from what came out. Like it's like he was trying to write like popular fiction. He wanted to be like Jules Verne, and he wrote this deeply experimental stuff. Avant-garde people liked him. Nobody else in the world liked him. I was like, what is that? And that's actually how this whole project started, is I was interested in people who try really hard to do something, end up doing something else that they didn't want to do. Raymond Roussel was deeply unhappy about that. He's one of those people, like I think Noah Purifoy at the end, that, you know, it leaves them kind of in sadness. But it makes the work so interesting. So that was my challenge. And then I sort of I turned back to that Jack Halberstam book, which I'd read some years ago. And then I grouped sort of levels of failure. I was looking at sort of systemic failure, where people who were like the women filmmakers, the early women filmmakers who were pushed out of the industry. So I had them, and then I was people like Roussel who were trying to do something and made something else. And then I looked at people who were really trying to do political change, like Noah Purifoy and Tucumán Arde, which is impossible. So it's like it's made for failure, and that was kind of the space in which they were creating it. I researched probably for 3 years, sort of the whole time I was making it.
Mhm. I enjoyed your afternote where you talk about the success biographies that populate children's book sections. And, you know, as you mentioned, you know, like some of these people are people that are raised from the story of their chosen discipline, like Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven and Alice Blanchet, Guy Blanchet. For what they had to say, or, you know, for what they had to say, like Tucumán Arde. And I was wondering, as a parent or as a mentor of a future artist, do you think you would want to prepare them for what might be a difficult life by telling them all the ways that structures of power have silenced artists? Or would you worry that they would not assert themselves and their talents if they knew ahead of time how many artists fail to get their visions across and recognized by their communities?
That's a good question, because I will say the funny thing about those books is we have a million of them. Like, I mean, like those books I name at the end, like the various sort of category of children's books that are like celebrations of the success against the odds, like the one person who did something. But so we actually read those books kind of religiously. But I do think that there is something. I mean, I do think it's a neoliberal vision of success. Like, I mean, there is like, it's this idea of this is the person who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, so we don't have to look at the system.
Right.
With children, we want to celebrate that, right? But I think that we also do need to recognize, I think children do need to be sort of taught about the systems. And also, I think, realize that there's other sort of healthier ways of making that aren't just purely sort of put into this sort of success failure binary. So that's the space we're always kind of looking for. So I'd say that like I encourage my daughter to sort of celebrate art, but I really, really don't want her to think about it sort of competitively or capitalistically. So that would be sort of the message, the best I can do.
Mhm. The one thing that I was thinking about, like one of the things that I like about the Academy is that it has very clear definition of what success or failure. It's like, did you publish it? Then it's a success. Like if you can write it on a Vita, you don't have to worry about it after that. It's done. I was wondering also, like, how do you choose your images, and what are you looking for when you pair a specific image with a particular narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, my background in sort of lit studies was studying the avant-garde, and I got really, really interested in constraint-based writing. So I think that one of the things with a project like this is I like set like clear parameters as to what I have to do. Like once I find a person, so I had a stack of comics that my stepfather had given me some years ago. They were coverless. They were, like somebody's discard comics, basically. And I had a rule that I was only going to use those. And then at one point, and what I would do is I'd go through the comic and I would just isolate a figure. And if possible, it was a human. Other times it was goo, sometimes it was aliens. And I'd be like, okay, I gotta try to keep this figure, take everything else out, and make this figure into this artist. And that was my rule. And the the hardest thing I did is in the center of the book, I actually did a whole comic from start to finish, this Tomb of Terror comic. So I included in it, I remade the cover, but I include this comic in there because I took every single one of the stories and made something new out of it. And at least one or two of them I thought was just straight up impossible. I thought there was just no way I was going to be able to do it. But it was the rule I set myself. And I think that's probably why Tukimon Arte became Space Aliens, because I said it has to be this comic. So that's how I choose it. And then the photos in the background are all Depression era, they're WPA photos. So stuff that was the works projects. And I chose those partially because, I mean, they're beautiful and they're public domain, but they're also like, I'm interested in sort of the fact that they're from all this stuff that's from the Depression, and they tend to be rural photography from the Depression. I think it gives this weird sort of unsettling nature to it. And I print them all out on my really crappy printer, which is sort of, I swear, this crappy printer I won't ever let go because it's part of my process. And sometimes, like with the Tucumán Arte, I actually like the green in the background is that I just kept forcing it to print until it ran out of ink, because I just thought that it gave it like a really eerie sort of horror vibe. It's a crazy way to make comics. I actually think I actually might be the only person who makes comics exactly like this, which is probably a sign that it's not a particularly logical way to make comics.
Well, I was thinking that so much of your work is like found art, or kind of like the absurd or assemblage. So it reminded me a lot of like the artists that you've paralleled. And I was thinking like, do you see your own work as fitting into this like larger narrative begun like by artistic movements like Dadaism, and its questioning of received artistic conventions? Or do you see your work as questioning the mythologies of movements like Dadaism which over time may have developed their own conventions or accepted narrative?
Yeah. Maybe both. I mean, it's like I studied those movements a lot. I mean, and Tucumán Arte came to my attention when I was working on my dissertation about that. I was looking for examples of like what's the most political art you could come up with, and that was an example that literally everyone's just like, this is where art and politics becomes absolutely inseparable. And I became really interested in that. I'd say that if there's somebody who I sort of identify with the most, it's probably Noah Purifoy. Who I read, that's it's the last one in the book, but he is part of movements at sort of various points. The assemblage movement, the assemblage stuff that he's doing is, comes into a lot of sort of traditions, and is now, you can find, has actually now been sort of picked up and is now being shown again, sort of in the last couple of years. But he has that idea of putting unlike things together and sort of see what happens. And in doing that, one of the things is you're attempting to sort of shape your own narratives. You're sort of questioning how our narratives get put together. But it's also ultimately futile. So it's like, that's why I like him so much, because it's like, this is what I'm trying to do, and I actually am interested in art that sort of can actually change things, while also recognizing that it's sort of a miserable thing. So I would say, in answer to your question, I mean, it really is both. Like, I think I'm responding to those traditions while also questioning them.
That's a great answer. I was wondering, for Johnny Damm, what do you consider artistic success?
Oh, wow. I mean, I just want people to read my books. I mean, yeah, I'm
Like an audience.
yeah, I just something. Yeah, I always tell people that, like, I'm trying to like claw my way up to sort of cult writer status, right? Like, I think that's sort of good enough, is just to have sort of there's small groups of people who are really interested in what I'm doing. I'd probably like it to just be a little bit bigger, right? Maybe to get into the conversation a little bit more. But I do know that, I mean, my publisher is a very like is kind of a radical publisher that has sort of a radical sort of political agenda in there. And I do sort of subscribe to that, which is sort of trying to not sort of embrace sort of the logic of the marketplace in terms of your work, which is a little bit of a sucker's game, and probably something I can't do, in all honesty. I keep thinking I'm making the most accessible work in the world, and people are like, this is crazy. This was my commercial work.
Are you getting to be a little bit like Rousseau?
A little bit. It might be. And that's probably why I started with him.
Yeah. What are your favorite comic artists today?
Oh yeah. I mean, I just finished teaching a comics class, which was great. And I'd say Jaime Hernandez, who does the comic Love and Rockets, which is Los Angeles based. That's probably my favorite comic of all time. There's a lot of really great artists who are working now who I'd say I have a little bit of a kinship with. There's a guy named R. Scissorak who does these. He illustrates. I guess it's pastiche, and he did the Apple. It was actually originally, I guess, it was the iPod user agreement. And he made a comic only using that as the text, and every page was in the style of a different comic. And he also just did that with the Constitution. So he does it so it looks like one page will suddenly look like, like Garfield or something, and then you'll turn to the next and it'll look like a horror comic. I think what he's doing is great. Lael Westman is a young cartoonist that I really love, who writes this kind of dreamy, sort of poetic stuff that's all about labor, like making things with your hand. It's kind of fascinating. It's a great time for comics. There's so much really, really good comics. I mean, it's not a good time economically, but this is, I think, in the US, we probably have more sort of comic talent on the ground than I think any time in history.
I'm just curious, like, but the aesthetic of like the 40s kind of, what, I mean, other than that, you had this stack and you made this vow to yourself. Why, why do you think you made that vow?
I mean, it is my favorite era of comics, sort of artistically, I think. I
Mhm.
mean, like, they're not always super readable. But there was this moment, I mean, particularly when you're talking about the 40s, where there's all these publishers. I mean, and comics is before television. So I mean, like literally 98% of all kids had read a comic in the last month. And there was this poll,
Oh,
60% of all adults had read several comics in the last month in this poll. So like everybody read comics. And so there was this huge influx, I think, into the industry. And the rules as to what a comic had to be were just wide open. And people were, I think, almost like recklessly experimental with how they used the pages, particularly with some of the sort of lower budget outfits that paid real bad, but let sort of the artists do whatever they wanted. And so there's really, really striking work. And actually, it was a time too where there was a moment where comics in the before the Comics Code, which was in 1954, there was a lot of women working in comics. There was a fair number of Black artists working in comics, as well as the sort of Jewish children of immigrants that are sort of most famously known as the comics creators. So it was just an amazing time, and the aesthetic of the art is absolutely striking, until it gets ruined by the Comics Code. That mass censored the medium and nearly put a good deal of the publishers out of business.
mm. Well, I didn't really know about the Comics Code. It, I did think a lot about like that moment in time. Like your book made me think, especially in the section that talks about jobs, like a film producer is a good job for a woman. And I was like amazed that that was there, but then it like disappears. But I think there's a lot of moments in various kinds of I don't know, not genres, but technologies, I guess, like early moments when it's kind of anything goes. And it's
Yeah,
when before things have gotten a certain kind of status so that folks that don't have status within the culture can find jobs there before they're competing with folks that have like an old boys network or whatnot to, and it made me think about, because I was thinking about television originally. But you're right, like it's kind of like the same group that's involved in television to a certain extent, radio, but and the comics of that time, like lots of children of immigrants
yeah.
and others that, you know, later on will be pushed aside for because it becomes high status.
No, that's totally right. I mean, it's the thing with film. It's like we're so proud because like 16% of the movies that came out last year were directed by women, which was like a high for sort of ages. If you went back to turn of the century, um, there was a period where women really dominated film production. They were the most powerful actors. They owned their own studios, and they were the most powerful directors. And Alice got Blaché. I mean, she really was. She invented the field, but then big money floods in, and then yeah. And in comics, it was a particular the comics. It was actually the field kind of shrunk a little bit, and that's when everybody got pushed out. Where in movies, it was kind of like the money came in, and that's what pushed people out. But all of this somehow relates to Jack Halberstam's sort of the queer art of failure and the sort of space of failure. Um, I, I don't know exactly how, but that's why it's always been a thread of the book, because it's something that really fascinates me.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important to unearth those histories. And I think it's one of those things, like with Hollywood, for instance. I think anytime there's a discussion of sort of these achievements of women finally getting a chance to direct, I think you have to go back to the beginning and be like, hey, this is where we were before. US comics, people are like, yeah, it's finally getting diverse. It's like, well, yeah, when it was diverse, it was 1948.
Yeah, wow.
So,
This, it actually reminds me of a story from Catherine Gallagher has a book called Nobody's Story, and it's about novels, basically the literary marketplace in the 18th century. And it's basically dominated by women. You know, I
Mhm.
mean, you can imagine, because even the things that become canonical, like Roxanne and Ma Flanders and Pamela and Clarissa, they all have women's names because even though, because the male authors were kind of like imitating these kind of stories of women that were, you know, that dominated the marketplace at the time. But later critics, at least Catherine Gallagher argues, just kind of cherry picked the male, like, you know,
Yeah.
they recognized Defoe as an early, like, father of the novel, but kind of ignored the women of the novel. Although she has a great story from Sir Walter Scott, who talks about his grandmother wanting him to get her a copy of an Afro Ben novel, because she remembered how much they enjoyed it in her youth, that they would all sit around reading it aloud in mixed company. And he was shocked. He was like, oh, well, she's pornographic. So he got the novel for her, but then he wrapped it in brown paper so no one would see, and gave it to her. And then the grandmother was actually shocked. She's like, I guess I misremembered. But you know, Afro Ben's in oh gosh, the cathedral where they keep all the great artists in London. Um, I'm just like blanking of it, but you know, she was well known for
Yeah.
her time. But then later, it took us until like basically when I was in grad school in the 90s, and they're like, hey, have you ever heard of this unknown Afro band? Like, let's put her in the
Yeah.
Norton anthology, you know? So I think, I mean, the novel was an early technology for, you know, in 18th century England. So I guess it's kind of a similar thing, that it wasn't high status at the time. So um, I was wondering also, you blend so many different things in this work. You know, obviously your comic books and um, artistic histories, and I'm just wondering also about what kind of like fields of criticism have been influential in creating your work and your thinking.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I'd say that in particular, art criticism. I mean, I this book is really deeply uh, it it owes a lot to a few different sort of critics. There's a guy named actually a really great artist who's also a critic named Louis Kamnitzer, who did something similar to what we were talking about in terms of histories of conceptual art. And he wrote a book that was all about conceptual art in Latin America, and how conceptual art in Latin America was always political because it was happening in this time where, you know, there was all the, you know, I mean, the mass repression and sort of country after country for various regimes that the U.S. helped prop up. But uh, he had this way, you know, he says, because conceptual art today, like, and U.S. conceptual artists have this whole sort of like purity of art sort of thing. This is like art about art. And his, you know, his idea that, I mean, I have a piece in here about a wrestler, or a guy, sort of performance, a wrestler who is also a political activist named Super Mario Gomez. Um,
Mhm.
and Louis Kamnitzer decided that guy needed to be in the history of conceptual art, right? Even though he's a political activist and literally like a wrestler in the mask. You know, this is Mexico City. So that type of thinking, I'm just sort of obsessed with. I would say that sort of I read a lot of, I guess you could say, sort of counter histories. Um, so Howard Zinn is of course super big. Um, uh, Roxanne Dunbar or Roxanne
Or-
Dunbar or
Ortiz.
yeah, Ortiz, yeah, Indigenous histories. Robin D. Kelly, Freedom Dreams. This great Kelly Little Hernandez's City of Inmates. These are all like sort of, I guess, sort of how we were talking about sort of movies and comics and all these, all works that sort of unearth um, sort of earlier histories in various sort of ways, trying to sort of get us to sort of see it, I guess, sort of how more people saw it at the time. Um, that's my sort of obsession that's the thread I think in all the work I make, is this sort of counter historical stuff about sort of getting us to see history's different connections. So Kamnitzer is definitely in there. And then all these, I guess you could say, counter historical or counter narrative historians in the tradition of Howard Zinn.
Well, those are great, great places to look for some of these stories.
Yeah. That's I actually just say Kamnitzer is how I discovered a couple of these, and Kelly Jones, who's writes about LA work. I discovered Noah Purifoy, or I'd heard of Noah Purifoy, but her characterization of Noah Purifoy I borrowed from very heavily. She's out of LA too.
There's actually I already knew about Super Barrio because in Karen Yamashita's Tropic of Orange, which is set
Oh,
partly in Los Angeles, has this character Super Nafta, who's a
yeah,
lucha libre fighter, and he kind of,
I've read that book.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of like I think that she's based him on the Super Barrio guy, and I think that judgment of him as a kind of, you know, as an artist is a very good one, because I mean it's, I mean, I get like I like the idea of Tucumán Arte as like the kind of the extreme pole of political art, but I think there's a lot of versions of that, I think, out there. I was just trying to think like what would be something similar in our time, and the only example I could come up with, I thought, was when John Oliver did a story on he did, you know, an episode of his television show on medical debt, and then he took a part of the budget and he paid off the debt. He just like bought
Yeah,
off the
yeah,
debt. It was like, you know, you could buy it for like pennies on the dollar if you were a collection agency, but just the people couldn't get out of their debt otherwise. And it was just interesting to me. It's like, and you know, of course he did it up and like had balloons and all these things. You're like, congratulations. But I just thought like that's kind of the ultimate, to me at the time, that was like the ultimate pole of like where a kind of art or performance could have a political, you know, actually could foment political change. You
yeah.
know, like you take your budget and you get people out of this kind of like legal servitude because of their medical debt. Um, so I was just wondering, are there any others that you could think of that would be like either moving towards that pole or
I mean, I think there's a lot of contemporary artists right now whose work is increasingly, the line between activism and the art, you know, totally blurs. I mean, somebody like Dred Scott, who's been around since the 80s. He just recently, what is his newest work? Is he put up he's a Black artist, and he put up a white person for sale as an NFT.
hmm,
So it was like the sort of reenacting of you know, buying with slavery, but through NFTs. I mean, and that was and it's, you know, the guy's really for sale. I mean, it's like, it's not the, you know, it's not just an act, like it's also an active commerce. So there's a lot of people like that really, you know, they're working within the museum spaces, they're working outside of the museum spaces. There's sort of this documentary quality, but so it's like they're showing you things that are happening in the world, but also they're pretty clear that they want to sort of take an active hand. Noah Purifoy, of course, would say that's going to lead to heartache. Like I mean, he was really bitter at the end of his life about not the art not doing anything.
yeah.
But I mean, I think that's part of the risk. I mean, and that's part of that. That's why it's always operating in the realm of failure.
Mhm.
Even if you are able to sell that guy as an NFT, or even if you are able to eliminate some of that, buy off some of that medical debt, it's still it still hasn't changed the world, I guess.
Right. It's still in the realm of performance as opposed to
It is still in the realm of performance. No, I mean, I have a piece in here that's perhaps the most contemporary work in here is a guy by the name of Pope L. He's one of my favorite contemporary artists, and he, I tell the story that he got what he thought was genetic material from Martin Luther King, and he tried to inject people with the DNA of Martin Luther King to spread Martin Luther King. Now, Pope L is probably deeply unreliable, so you have no idea if this is true. But I mean, his claim, and it's in the story, is that they had this idea of putting Martin Luther King's genetic material in the air. And he says, you know what would be good? A good way to spread genetic material, the AIDS virus. And so he's like, what would it be like if we mixed Martin Luther King's genetic material with the AIDS virus and shot it in the air? And of course, the people he was working with were like, we're done. But I mean, talk about trying to make it real. So yeah, I follow a lot of contemporary art. I mean, I guess that's the other sort of thread here.
I was curious about that story, like why he thought DNA might change your morality.
That's much, I will say that's a much, I totally oversimplify that story. I sent that book to Pope L, who's in Chicago, who I don't know, but I happen to know his address. I got his address, and I've always wondered what he thought about it, because I do oversimplify that project. I only tell this one thread of it. But the larger project, you can sort of tell he's being a little bit more ironic, even if he actually did it. It was a little bit more ironic because he also was had all this work that references the fact that Martin Luther King cheated on his wife. So there's actually this stuff when he talks about inseminating Martin or something. He says he uses that as sort of like a metaphor. He's also talking about hero worship and sort of the impossibility of us actually being that good because Martin Luther King was
human
around, right? So that's actually in the piece. I leave that part out because it's just like that's it's a whole other piece. There's a whole other sort of bit to it. But I love that work, even though it's deeply disturbing. The AIDS virus part of it in particular.
Yes. You guys, like I have taken all of his time, but like Alan and Mary and Brandon, do you guys have any questions that you want to ask? I notice there's none in the Q&A, and I don't see any in the chat, but I just want to make sure you have
No, I don't.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Johnny, for sharing your work with us. That was a really fun evening.
Thank you so much. That was fun for me too.
See you on the hallways of the faculty office building.
Yes. Thanks, y'all.
Take care, you guys.